in our series of 10 webinars. We're going to take a look at step number 8, which is baselining, as I like to call it, crossing the T's and dotting the I's. So we've got a fair number of people already logged in, so I think we're all set to go. So let's go ahead and get started. As is usual, we have our lovely Lauren hosting or helping us out today on the technical side, and myself, David, your presenter for today. Just a quick note on the sound/technology. If you're having any issues, please use the chat window to just give us a quick heads up. We'll see what we can do. And as always, we are recording these so that you can always watch them later. So if we do run into any serious technical issues. And yeah, last time we ran into some sound issues, but we've actually had the techs in and they've fixed our internet connection, and there was a bad router, and so I think we should be good for today. The control panel should be up on your right side, and the first button at the top, the little red arrow there, will collapse it down. So if you need a little more real estate on your screen, you can collapse that down. The second icon I just want to point out is the little blue round one, which brings up the text box window, the chat window. So if you need to fire us a quick note or let us know something's going on. And then finally, you can raise your hand so that you can let us know that there's an issue or just draw some attention. As always, we like to make these sessions interactive, so we will be asking you questions and polls. So when you see this symbol pop up on your screen, that's your chance to provide some input. Excuse me, provide some input and interact. So I think that covers it. Our opening thought comes from Confucius. Life is simple, but we insist on making it complicated. Now, I chose this one for this session because we often get very complicated in how we track our projects. And really the main focus of step number 8 is to figure out how we're going to track our projects and set those pieces in place so that when we move into step 9 or execution, we have the tools, we have the techniques, we have the instruments that are going to tell us how our project is doing. And it's very easy to get distracted down into the weeds of all kinds of details. So my advice for you on this step is let's try to keep things simple. And it kind of harkens back to Einstein's quote, keep things as simple as possible, but not too simple. So we're going to try and find that balance. We're going to revisit our challenges from the first session, and similar to risk, there's a lot that we're going to be hitting here. So things like communications, and when we put together our project plan, the really base essence or requirement there is around communications. Nailing down the requirements, an ongoing challenge, and this step really is designed to help with that, as well as getting support from senior management, as this step is really all about finalizing those, getting the sign-off, getting the approval, and moving forward with that. Getting the team to understand the scope. Well, once we have the sign-off, once we have it nailed down, we can communicate that out, and then of course sticking to the previous decisions, which really layers on top of the nailing down the requirements and getting that support from senior management. Because if we can do that well during our planning phase, we'll have less opportunity or less possibility for that changing as we move forward. So we're on step number 8, which is approve the scope statement, approve the project management plan, and establish those all-important baselines. Just as a quick recap, again, step number 8 of our 10. So after this, we've got 2 more to go, and then we'll be starting our next series after that. And we'll talk about that when we get to step 10. So our first question is actually a 2-parter, and we're going to ask you to use the chat box to answer. Sorry, the question box to answer. Apologies. The first question is, what is the baseline? Just kind of looking for a definition, and then as a sort of follow-up to that, what is it used for? So be looking for that in the questions box. Okay, just waiting for some responses to come in. Oh, I saw a flicker or something. There we are. Awesome, starting to get some answers in, beautiful. All right, so let's take a look at what we have. Ooh, Fast and Furious now, awesome. From Timothy, your original view of the timeline Excellent, right? So that's what our baseline is. A guideline for where we should be. Justin, awesome. From Sarah, a basic, reasonably accurate, yeah, I love that word, reasonably accurate, Sarah. That's, yeah, beautifully. Reasonably accurate starting point from which should be used for comparison purposes, right? And then the next question, of course, what are we going to compare that to? Somewhere to start to know if you are meeting the projected goals. Beautiful, Michelle, thank you. The time when your project timeline has been agreed upon by the team. Yes, Nicole, absolutely. And not only agreed upon by the team, but also by your sponsors, by your senior management, so kind of the larger team. Set of requirements from Kenneth. Requirements really kind of build the baseline, because really it's more about defining that timeline, that cost line that we're going to track against. But I do agree with you, Kenneth, that we should baseline our requirements so that we know when there's a change and we know when we need to make an adjustment. Agreed upon terms and conditions. Very well said, Mary. Baseline is a quantifiable, documented state of current affairs. Interesting, Anna. I'd like to expand on that, if you could. Just thinking, because the baseline really is about, what is my projected plan, as opposed to the current affairs. Now, I think you're really more answering the what is it used for question there. And just finish up on the first one from Roberta. Starting point for comparison of schedule cost, absolutely. So really we want to just, let's flesh out a little bit what it's used for. So if you have some thoughts around that. Points of reference to measure success of your project. Interesting, interesting. We're going to explore that one a little bit later, Joaquin. So we're looking for what is it used for. Okay, so let's just explore this show variation. Yes, absolutely, Roberta. Baseline is a reference document for scope, work costs, schedules, etc. Yep, that's actually leading into our next question. From Sarah, way to gauge where we are in the cost, schedule, and timeline against where we thought we would be. Absolutely what we're using it for. So totally agree. So these are all great answers. To set expectations. Oh, yes, Nicole, thank you. Yay. To set expectations, when we're looking at how things are progressing and how we expect them to be progressing. So, really help manage those expectations. It's such an important key piece. And to expand on that, she continues to say, when we're in change control mode, in the event of changes, absolutely. So this becomes our basis for our change control discussions. Roberta, can be reset based on agreed change management, absolutely. And measure conformity and progress from Mary. Yes, absolutely. Beautiful. Excellent. So we've all got a very clear picture, I think, now. Baseline is what our plan is. It's valid when it's agreed upon, and it's used to control our project and see how we're doing. Are we ahead? Are we behind? Are we over? Are we under? What's the variance look like? So the next question is, what should be included? There we go. What should be included in the baseline? I'm going to challenge you to go beyond the time and cost. So what should be included in our baselines? Critical path, milestones, great, Tim. Absolutely, cost, scope, cost, scope, and quality. Yes, love it. You should have quality in there as well, absolutely. Critical path items, time to complete from Kenneth, absolutely. Scope, deliverables, quality from Roberta. Yes, yes, yes. Oh, stakeholder requirements from Ramesh. I love it. Yes. So identifying what are the stakeholder requirements, what's the baseline on that to see if there's a change. So I think all of us are agreeing the scope, cost, schedule pieces are all should be there. But a lot of people don't think about things like quality or even risk or, what does that look like and the requirements. Milestones management to ensure that we're communicating to stakeholders and to our sponsor from Nicole, absolutely. So some really good answers today. We want to think, what could we, A, and B, what should we be included beyond just the time and cost? Now, when we talk in terms of, what should be included in our baseline, absolutely schedule, bless you, scope, schedule, and costs. And of course, scope really drives our schedule and drives our costs. So, looking at the artifacts that we have developed over our time together in these webinars, using the network diagram to represent our scope, our Gantt chart, of course, to represent our schedule, and of course, our S-curve to represent our cost timeline. Now, I want to take this back to a comment that was, or an answer that was made earlier around measuring success of the project. Now, if we're only measuring schedule and cost, and actually even to a lesser degree, but also if we're measuring scope from just a baseline perspective, if I deliver on time, on scope, on budget, do I have a successful project? And if you remember back to session 1, we had that discussion. So very simply, the answer is not necessarily, because as much as time and cost are very important factors, they do not drive the success of my project. What really drives the success of the project is, are we delivering what's needed? Are we delivering benefit to the organization? And is there the resulting product that comes out of this project? Is it, is it beneficial, and is there a return on our investment? So we're seeing more and more of the term investment being used for how the project is being engaged from a success perspective. Now, the problem that we have is that's a very hard thing to measure, and that can often be something that is measured, far down the road from when my project actually finishes. So we had this discussion in the cost piece when we talked about the life cycle costing of our project. And just to recap, we started out here with an idea. We then executed the project, so we did the spending of the money. So this scale is representing the negative being down below the line, where the line being our starting point. And we spent money. We stop spending money at the end of our project, and then we get into the payback period. So how long does it take for the resulting product to basically recoup the original investment? Hopefully, our product goes into the positives and actually gains us some profit or some benefit above the 0 line. And then, of course, we have the retirement, where oftentimes the curve tends to start to drop as we start to lose the benefit, or it becomes an expense to retire that product, whatever that looks like. So we get into this kind of curve here, and really it's about delivering something that is valuable and beneficial. So yes, we want to track how we're doing. Yes, we want to track to see if we're delivering on time, on scope, on budget, and these important factors. We also want to make sure we temper that with what are the priorities. So if I have a regulatory type project where we have a hard stop deadline, you have to deliver by this date, then we're going to be managing very tightly our timeline and perhaps not so much on the costing. Or vice versa, maybe the cost is the number one priority, or the scope is the number one priority. So we need to make sure that we have a very clear picture of that, so we don't end up trying to deliver something on time, on scope, on budget, and meanwhile what we end up delivering is not going to be useful to the client. And of course I'm using the term client both as an internal or an external client. So my question for you is, how far into the future can we plan at a detailed level? Now, before you answer this question, or this poll, when we say at a detailed level, I'm actually talking about creating a schedule, creating booking resources for that schedule. So when we're looking at a 5-year project, for example, you do not schedule resources 5 years out. You may identify some of the resources you might need, and you might have an idea when they're going to be there, but you don't actually, I'm talking about actually booking them into their calendars. So Lauren, if you can bring up that poll for us, please. So the poll is now open. %, voted, 33% voted. I'm coming in fast and furious here. 57%. So as usual, when we get to around 75–80%, we'll close it. 73%. Just give it a few more moments. Okay, there's our 80% mark. Okay, let's see what our results look like. Okay. So 3 days, no one was at the 3-day mark. Awesome. Now, we'll talk a little bit about why I put 3 days there in a second. 1 to 3 months, we got 20% saying that. 56% is saying 3 to 6 months, which is personally what I think is a reasonable window. 8% saying 6 to 12, and then 16% we need to plan the entire project at a detailed level from start to finish. Now, let's start with that last one, and let's just address that. I do agree with you. We do need to plan our project from a detailed perspective from right to the very end. However, we also need to temper that a little bit with the realities of if I'm dealing with a 2-year, 5-year project, realistically, I'm not going to be able to plan it at a detailed level 2-3 years out. So yes, I can define what my destination is. I can define what the end state is. I can even define the acceptance criteria, which I'm a big fan of doing, and I think you really should. But to realistically plan at a detailed level where we actually have people's schedules being booked, we can't go out that far. Now, let's talk a little bit about the difference between the 3 to 6 month and the 6 to 12 month, because in my humble opinion, 3 to 6 months is realistic. Depends upon your environment, depends upon how dynamic your environment is, depends upon how seasonal your environment is. So if we're doing, for example, outdoor construction work, then we're probably more in the 6 to 12 month range because we have a season, so we tend to plan for the season. So we're going to spend the winter planning for the summer construction season, and we're going to have those plans and details and bookings and you know, confirmations set out a little bit further ahead of time. If we're doing, let's say, IT type projects in a business environment, then I'm more leaning towards the 3 to 6 month. Now, let's talk a little bit about the benefits of the 3-day and the 1 to 3 month side of things. Let's first of all address the 1 to 3 months. It's going to drive me to this end of the spectrum are things like the amount of unknowns that are there. So when we get into projects where we have a huge number of unknowns, we're getting into the R&D type projects, the research and development, we're getting into the type of projects where we are doing this for the first time in the history of man. Then we're going to be closer to the 1 to 3 months end of the spectrum. If we're in a very dynamic environment, again, we're going to be more to the 1 to 3 month side of things. Now, the 3 days, although that's a little bit tongue-in-cheek, that's really the essence of Agile. So when we take a look at Agile as a methodology, it's really about taking the phase of the rolling, and the whole concept that we're actually talking about right now is the rolling wave. So when we go to that end of the spectrum, in Agile, you're going to be doing your planning on a, you know, one week type level. Now, we've still kind of figured out what our destination is. We might not have really fleshed it out completely, but we know what the need is. And the product definition can evolve for sure, but in a more agile environment, and again, it's actually a spectrum. So when we talk about waterfall versus agile, people tend to be very black and white. It's very much, it's like either way over here or way over there, depending upon whether you're agile or waterfall. But there really is a spectrum, because I can take a waterfall, a traditional waterfall type project, and run it more like with an agile flavor to it and vice versa. So the concept here that we're talking about really is your planning horizon. And the planning horizon is all about, okay, I know what my destinations are. I know what my deliverables are. I know where those points are. And those are represented by the flags on this, this mountain that we're looking at. So being the mountain climber at the bottom, I'm at base camp. I can see Camp 1. And I've got a very clear view of my ascent from base camp to Camp 1. My view from Camp 1 to Camp 2 is not quite as clear. And similarly from Camp 2 to 3, the summit, from 3 to 4, can't see that at all, from 4 to 5. Now, if I continue to use this analogy, you could argue, well, we do know what 3 to 4 looks like because there's other people who've done it before, and we get their reports, and we, you know, maybe we have done it before, and this is not our first ascent on this mountain. And you're absolutely correct. If I'm doing a project where I have done this 1,000 times before, I've done this, I have experience, I have an experienced team, then you know what, I can, at a more detailed level, plan, you know, from 3 to 4, and reasonably expect that that's how it is going to go. There's always going to be some changes, of course. Now, if I go to the other end of the spectrum where we have the R&D type project, then I'm kind of breaking new ground here, and there's going to be some factors that I'm not privy to, I don't know, and we're going to have to deal with those as we go. One of the reasons I really like the mountain climber analogy is, as we saw in last month's session, the conditions can change very, very quickly. And if you've had any experience in mountainous regions, literally within a few minutes, you can be in a very different environment. And every time I've gone up into the alpine zones, I've always experienced that. So, how dynamic is our environment that we're actually working within? Is it something that can change very quickly, or is it very stable? The more stable it is, the more I can plan long term. The less stable it is, the more we're up into that alpine zone, the more I'm going to need to be flexible and reactive and shorten my planning cycle. Now, I'm not suggesting we don't say, okay, let's plan all 5 years at a high level. 100%, we do need to do that. But it is going to be at a high level. And when we talk in terms of managing expectations, we need to make sure that we manage those expectations, especially with the non-PM savvy types. Because in the non-PM savvy types, that whole little bit of knowledge is dangerous. They believe that we PMs are magic workers who can plan the whole 5 years and execute the whole 5 years. And, you get the comments like, well, why can't you tell me the exact date 5 years from now? I thought you were a project manager. Well, reality is no one can. That's just not realistic. So we need to, again, try to get our team on board, try to get, our stakeholders working with us as opposed to working against us. So sometimes that requires a little bit of education. Okay. So this next slide is really just a recap of the process. We started with step 1, which was initiating. And we defined what the project is. We defined some of the high-level items, such as what's the nature of this project? Are we doing an R&D type project with lots of unknowns, and it's going to be very dynamic? Or are we doing, this is number 1001? Do we really know tightly what that looks like? We then went into defining our scope, and we broke our scope down into 3 areas. The first was the why, or the problem, need, or opportunity that really is going to drive the whole project. And that problem, need, or opportunity is going to drive the product, which is our product scope, and the product is going to drive the project, which is the work. So depending upon whether we need, so to use examples from my world, whether you need some training or you need a user manual or you just need a job aid, that resulting product is really going to change what the project, what the work is going to be to deliver that. We then get into step 3, which is roles, responsibilities, and estimates. So now that we know the work to be done, let's figure out who's going to do it. Figure out how much work there is there, and let's develop some estimates. And again, the more we can get resources into those roles, the more accurate of an estimate we can deliver. And this actually supports this whole concept of the rolling wave and the plan in short-term chunks, because you'll have much better, more direct estimates. Now the challenge comes, of course, when our sponsors, our client, they don't want a short-term accurate estimate. They want a long-term accurate estimate. Well, we can't do that. That's just not realistic. So what we need to do is we need to work with them on that and manage those expectations. We sequence our work. We analyze our critical path, putting it into that network diagram, figuring out what happens first and second. So we're now really starting to flesh out those details, and we develop our Gantt charts and our network diagrams and our histograms and all those kind of fun things. But we really can't do that until we're right down to the details of the work. Now, with that in mind, and this is where people often push back on this whole concept of rolling wave. They say, well, but I have to give them a detail of the whole thing. Well, you don't have those details. And the more I try to do a long-term detailed plan, the more you're going to have change along the way. So if you want to reduce the amount of change through your project, do it in shorter chunks, do it in shorter pieces. Keeping in mind, of course, that as you get the answers to those smaller pieces, they're going to feed input to the next phase or the next wave. This will allow you to manage your project at a more detailed level. This will allow you to manage it with greater accuracy, and this will really allow you to be much more effective in that management of that project. It'll also help you with rework. So if you think about that larger, big, long project and think, okay, well, let's do these other pieces where we don't really necessarily have the details to feed in. As you get those details, you might have to go back and change and rework. So that's not a very efficient model. We really want to try to do the right thing right the first time. We develop our cost estimates. Again, until we've actually resourced our project, we can't get a very good, accurate estimate. To use a simple example, if we're going to build a house, we need to dig a hole for the foundation. So we're building our houses. Let's say it's 20 feet by 30 feet. So 20 feet wide, 30 feet deep. If I give you a shovel and I ask you to dig a hole that's 20 feet long, 30 feet wide, and 6 feet deep, it's going to take you a while. Now, let's say 20, 30 days. Now, what if I gave you a backhoe? Assuming you have the skills to operate it, it's probably going to take you a day, maybe 2. So depending upon how you resource that, it's going to be very different. And it's also going to be very different in cost, because to employ you with a shovel for 20 days is a different cost than to employ a backhoe for 2 days. So if we really want to get accurate on these elements, then we need to break it down to that more detailed level, and hence we can only do that on that shorter term timeline. Layering step 7, which was our previous step, which is risk. We need to do our risk assessments. Now, we're not professing that you wait until this point to do risk. No, you should be doing it throughout. It's just, from a sequential of the steps, this is where it fits in. But, you do want to do that, and you want to think about the risks and identify them. And honestly, until you get to that shorter timeline into that, from a rolling wave perspective, you're not going to be able to do really effective risk management. And that brings us to where we are today, which is step 8. Which is review your project management plan, and you notice that dotted arrow that goes all the way back up to defined scope. You review the plan, you look at the details and say, this works, this doesn't, we have that resource, we don't have this resource, we juggle things around, we figure out when those people are, and we actually book their time. So, now we're getting down into the nitty-gritty of, are you available to come work on my project, in July, in August? And considering it's November now, you're probably thinking, that's a little bit too far out. I'm kind of not really able to book my schedule that far out. So, okay, so let's maybe look at doing a tentative booking, in which case we now, from a baselining perspective, we need to be aware of that, and that we're going to have some flexibility there. But the further out you go, the more tentative it is. So if I want to book your time, let's say in the next month into December or even January, I probably can pretty solidly book that. But if I want to book you out in July and August, yeah, it's more tenuous, it's more tentative. So we loop through this cycle, and then we get the plan, and then finally we get approval for the plan, because as many of us work in an environment where you need approval to transition from planning into execution. Keeping in mind that what we do as project managers is we execute on the project plan that's been agreed upon. So we are there spending the resources money, we're there spending the resources times, and at the end there should be some deliverable. Well, the question is, do we have approval to do that? And really that's what this step is all about, is about getting that approval. So when we look back at the challenges, I'm talking about getting senior management support, well, this is the time when you go to them and ask that hard question and say, sign here. And whether that's a physical signature or an email or whatever method that you use around that, it's all about getting the sign-off and getting the permission to start. And you want to make that a little bit more formal, especially if you have challenges with management, with sponsors who are coming back and saying, oh yeah, no, I don't agree with that, down the road. So this is your chance to really formalize that and kind of force that decision. Now, one of the things that I find when I get to this step is, depending upon how well I've done, especially step number 2, how well I've done the earlier steps, this is kind of when the rubber hits the road. This is when people are like, okay, let me really think about this. And now it's like, okay, we're about to go, so, have we thought this through? Okay. Now, I can't have a discussion about this session without bringing earned value into it. And I know earned value has this great love-hate relationship. There's many PMPs in the world who, yeah, I learned about earned value from my exam and I never used it again. I also know there's a lot who are just like, what? You don't use earned value? Are you nuts? So I'm a big fan of earned value. And when I talk about earned value, I like to look at it more from a concept perspective as opposed to a formula perspective. So we're going to look at it from a concept perspective. Now, assuming that we have done our jobs well, we have created artifacts like a Gantt chart, like an S-curve. Okay. Now we have the ability to drop a status line onto both of those documents, and we can see not only where we're at, but where we expect it to be at and where we're going to be. So, just putting my status line here at month 5, if I look at my Gantt chart, I can see that L1 and L3, well, L1 should be fully done, L3 should be about 50% done. Or sorry, L2, L3, I was looking at critical path. L1 should also be done, R1 should be done, R3 should be done, R2 should be done, M1 should be done. So there should be lots of stuff done at the beginning. Now, again, if I've done my job well, I have a dollar value on each of those. So my earned value is the work that I've accomplished. So I can simply look at those and say, what are 100% finished? There's my earned value. If it's 50% finished, well, half of that, there's my earned value. And then I can look at my S-curve and just simply read it. And in this case, the S-curve is showing just below 20, so it's about 18, 19, I think. So I now know my plan value. So I can look at my earned value, I can look at my plan value, and I can see how well I'm doing from a schedule perspective. The actual cost, well, that one actually doesn't really need a definition. I actually struggled putting the definition on that one. The actual cost is just that, how much it actually costs. So why do we bring this up here? Because you're looking at that going, well, that's more execution, that's more monitor and control. Why are we talking about it now? The reason we're talking about it now is because now is the time when you want to ask yourself a simple question. Have you installed the mechanisms, the instruments into your project plan that will give you this information to tell you how much you've accomplished, to tell you what your plan line looks like? I know I've done this, guilty as charged. I've run projects where I had a single number budget. I had a single number that was, okay, this project's going to run 50,000. And meanwhile, I didn't have the flow of money over time. So I didn't have a baseline. Right? So basically, you run the project, and at the very end, you go, oh, did we meet it or not? So we had no way of knowing at the 5% or 10% or 20% or any percentage point through the project where we're at. And on that note, on the percentage complete piece, where we are at, if we're using software such as MS Project, it wants to know what is our percentage complete on work packages, on tasks. And a word of caution here. Human brain, yeah, we don't do percentage complete so well. The other side of it as well is that the percentage complete that it's looking for is percentage complete on a schedule basis, not on work. And by this, what I mean, let's just use L3 as our example. So our status line drops right down through the center of that one. So percentage complete, if I'm on time, should actually be 50%. And if I actually put in there 50%, my software will say, okay, yeah, you're doing okay. However, the majority of the work is in the front. So this is a front-loaded activity. This is a front-loaded thing, which means 90% of the work is done. So if you ask someone, how much what's your status on L3, they'll say, well, I'm like 90% done. There's very little left. Because we tend to think in terms of the amount of work that we have to do. We don't tend to think in terms of schedule. So if L3 was, for example, an approval where I've written the document, I've fleshed it out, I've done it, and I've sent it for approval, and then when it comes back, I'm going to have some rewrites and updates. So absolutely, 90% of the work is done. But now, schedule-wise, I need to sit and wait for the feedback to come, and then I do a little minor updates, and then get it finalized. But I'm still at 50% from a schedule perspective. So what I like to do is I like to ask her, when do you project it being completed? And then I calculate the percentage complete based on that. Excuse me, based on that, so that we can put that value into the software and actually have some valuable metrics, because garbage in, garbage out, and we need to make sure that we're talking the same currency. And then hence that's one of the values of earned value, is that it actually brings everything back to dollars, so that when I'm doing my calculations, it's all, you're comparing apples to apples. So let's take a quick look at a scenario here. Here's our project. 10 widgets, 10 weeks, for a cost of $10,000. So that's our project plan, and we're gonna do a simple linear one just because we're doing this as a quick, simple thought experiment. Our status is we're at week 3, $2,500 is our actual. So my question for you is, how are we doing? So I'm going to get you to just use the question box to answer that. Let's see what some people are saying on this. So what do you think? How are we doing? There we go. All right, so Joe Quinn is saying behind, we're running over budget. Some variance to plan, looks like we're slightly ahead. Running under cost, approximately $1,000 per week, a little behind. Okay, so this is interesting responses, not exactly what I expected. So if we think about this, we got 10 widgets, 10 weeks, $10,000. So it's $1,000 a widget and 1 widget per week. All right, so if we're at week 3, end of week 3, and Michelle says, I used a quarter of the budget, not a third. So not bad. We're ahead on the dollars. No idea the status of development. Thank you, Peter. Yay. So this is actually a little bit of a mean question because I haven't given you enough information to get a proper estimate. Now, if I do the simple math here and say, well, I'm at the end of week 3, I should have built 3 widgets, $1,000 per widget. I should be at 3,000. It looks like we're actually under budget. The reality is, though, there we go. We've only built 2 widgets, so we're actually behind schedule. And because we've only built 2 widgets. Yeah, and Timothy just said, yes, but we have no context, so thank you, yay. When you get this scenario and you say, well, I'm at week 3 and I've only spent $2,500 and I compare that to my S-curve, you have a meaningless comparison. Okay, you truly have a meaningless comparison because until you know what you've accomplished, you can't figure that out. And that's what earned value, that's what its basis is how much product have I created, how much have I earned. And without that key piece of information, you're out of context. You've got some data, but you don't have any information. You don't have, any way of knowing. Because if I had actually built 3 widgets, then yeah, I'm under budget because I'm at 2,500. I should have spent 3,000, and so I'm spending less per widget. So you really need to carry it back to how much work you've accomplished, and that's where understanding your percentage complete and when you're actually going to do them, whether you're on schedule or not, gives you now a meaningful comparison against that. So yeah, it's an interesting concept, but you don't need to actually run the numbers. What you do need, however, I'm just going to back up a couple slides. What you do need, however, is you need this S-curve, because the S-curve will tell you where you should be from a costing perspective. You compare that to what you've actually accomplished on your Gantt chart, and the S-curve comes right out of your Gantt chart because that's where you get your schedule from. You put those dollars per task in your S-curve. It's just it's the mechanics of creating it now at this point. So assuming you've done a good Gantt chart, you've costed per activity, your S-curve is already there. It's just a question of representing the data. Now that I've done that, you have everything you need to do your earned value. You just have to get your reports as to what your accomplishments are. Okay, so we're going to move into our case study for our office move. Remember, it was our Acme Corporation. They decided to sell off the jet-powered roller skate division. Management decided to relocate the remaining divisions. Purpose of the project, reduce dollars. So there's one of our #1 priorities. So if I go and run this project where things go, highly over budget and so forth, I'm going to lose the benefit, right? So we want to have that in mind. Now, if you've ever worked on a Y2K type project where there was an absolute deadline, and oftentimes regulatory projects take on this kind of mode or this kind of nature, it's deliver it by this timeline at all costs. Okay, then it's it's a different focus, right? Minimal interruption to the operations. So I've got that transitional piece of we need to keep the operations going. We need to to maybe add some scope to help when we close the old office, open the new office, things like that, as well as helping the staff themselves with the transition. So we looked through steps 1 through 7 on this, and we got all kinds of great detail that came out of that, including things like our Gantt chart. So we know what tasks are happening on what days. We did some additional things like taking our Gantt chart and layering on the costing of how much it's going to cost for each of those different activities. And now that we know the timeline from our Gantt chart, we know the costing. By layering the costing on, we can create our S-curve. And creating the S-curve is really just the simple mechanics of taking that Gantt chart and doing a cumulative of our project costing. And we now have our S-curve. So now I can see what my costing should be like. Because cost is an important piece on this project, and likely they would actually accept a delay in the project over a cost increase, I now have a meaningful instrument that I can use to monitor and manage that as we execute. So we need to take all of these different elements that we have built over the past 7 steps and start to bring them all together. So things like our scope management plan, our quality management plan, our risk management plan, our HR management plan, our cost management plan, our project governance, who's making the decisions, what authority do I have as the project manager on this? And some of those artifacts are going to be represented through things like network diagrams and Gantt charts and S-curves, and and some of them are just going to be simple lists like a risk register or an issues log and so forth. But it's about taking all of these, bringing them all together under a integrated plan and getting a signature at the bottom of all that, saying sign here. Do we all agree this is what we're going to do? And if we can do that, and if we can do that well, we position ourselves not only to really know what we're supposed to do and have that expectation clear, but have that expectation clear with our sponsor and with our clients so that they can, know where we're supposed to go, and they can also, understand some of those metrics as we attempt to measure using our baselines going forward. So to kind of wrap this up with our key points, plan for tracking your project. You need to be thinking about, and this is where we're talking about being out in front of the project and thinking about what's coming down the pipe ahead of us. We need to be thinking about, well, how are we going to track our project once we actually move into execution? How are we going to make sure that we are delivering on those key elements? We want to get sign-off before the transition to execution. We are under constant pressure, do things faster, cheaper. It can be very easy to fall victim to the, let's start executing before we've got the sign-off. Get the complete picture, hence our EVM example or value. Make sure that you've got good metrics that are actually going to give you a more correct and clear picture. And finally, install the correct instruments. So what instruments? We often collect data because it's easy to collect. Well, let's collect data that's going to be meaningful and useful, and that can be sometimes hard and difficult. So as I was putting this together, I came across the world's most accurate pie chart. So I thought I would share this with you today. So this is the world's most accurate pie chart. The pie I have eaten and the pie I have not yet eaten. Ah, that was brilliant. Okay. I'm a big pie fan, so. All right, moving on. So life is really simple, but we insist on making it complicated. When I look at some of the best tools for monitoring our projects and for getting good metrics as to where we're going and how we're going to get there and so forth, I find that these simple models tend to work better. You can create a really good complex model. If it's not implemented well, it's going to fail. And this finding that right balance between making it simple enough that it's effective, making it simple enough so it's easy to implement, but not so simple that it's not effective. We need to find that right balance. And I'm sure you have experienced this as a team member. As a PM, when you put a highly complicated model in front of people, they tend to shy away from it. They'll tend to not follow it. They'll tend to not implement it. When you put a simpler model in, they'll tend to implement it. So what we end up with is make the right path easy, make the difficult or the wrong path difficult. So if I make the right path difficult, people aren't going to follow it. They're going to look for the simpler path. So let's try to keep life simple. Let's not insist on making it complicated, and let's get something that's going to be effective.